Well, welcome to Healthy Chats with the Doc. And yeah, today we're going to talk about specifically the CBS gene and gut health.
Yes.
So CBS, no, it's not NBC, ABC, it's not a TV station. It's actually gene, right? So what I love about CBS is, when we first started epigenetics, it was all about MTHFR. And then all of a sudden we're like, oh my God, CBS and MTHFR. And CBS was like the superstar. So talk to us a little bit about what is the CBS gene and how does it affect our metabolic pathways?
Yes. So yeah, the CBS gene is a big sort of catch point, if you will, in the factory, right? We always talk about this as a big biological factor with all these machines. And the start of the factory where everything begins is our MTHFR factory machine, right? The MTHFR machine is what makes methyl groups, which supports dozens of other metabolic activities within the factory, in our biological factory. The CBS gene is a quintessential transition point within that factory that, because of that, is really important because things can go one way or the other, basically. So essentially that gene codes for a synthase enzyme, a machine that converts homocysteine into cystathionine. And this step is what starts our sulfation metabolism pathway. So this is where we process sulfur groups in the body, also known as the transsulfuration pathway. And so this pathway, as it's processing sulfur groups, has a lot of different functions. It makes other sulfur amino acids like taurine or glutathione, which is really important. And it also binds sulfur groups to toxins that need to be excreted out of the body. So it's also a detoxification pathway. So this is the transsulfuration section of the factory that processes sulfur compounds and takes out trash in a very specific way. And that CBS gene codes for that important machine, that synthase enzyme machine that converts homocysteine specifically into cystathionine, which starts that whole section of the factory rolling. So that's essentially what that gene does, is enter into that sulfation phase for those sort of key steps of activity, which, I could go on and on, but I'll leave it at that brief summary for now.
Yeah, well, doctor, those are big words for the average person. So what you're saying is, like, I think a lot of people may not know, how genes actually interface with enzymes and proteins and those types of things. So, but what I hear you saying as a layperson is this is a very important gene to convert, different enzymes and proteins. But you said a word, homocysteine, which I always kind of relate to homocysteine to heart health. So,
right. Yep.
Yeah. So why would homocysteine have a connection to gut health?
Excellent question. So so homocysteine, a lot of you may have heard us talk about that in other talks before or read about in other places. Homocysteine is an intermediate. So in these machines, what happens first is we make methionine, and that makes some other important components, and then that gets recycled into homocysteine, and then homocysteine goes on to cystathionine. Homocysteine itself is just an intermediate. It doesn't have a whole lot of function outside of being a breakdown product of methionine or a precursor to cystathionine. So homocysteine, when it gets too high, because we may have some genetic variances that slow that metabolism down, then when homocysteine gets too high, it damages blood vessels, which is why we associate it with heart health and heart disease risk. But in this particular case, it's related to the CBS gene and gut health, because homocysteine, when the CBS machine breaks homocysteine down into cystathionine, that's the first component of the sulfation pathway. So what can happen is that the sulfation pathway, that transsulfuration part of the factory I was talking about, is actually kind of slow. There's a natural bottleneck in that part of the factory. So things go a little bit too slowly in that side of the factory. And so because of that, things can get backed up kind of easily and cause some problems. When there is a CBS gene mutation, what we usually talk about in these chats is that when there's a gene mutation, the resulting machine or enzyme often is just broken and slow and doesn't really work. But in the case of CBS, that machine actually goes faster, not slower, when there's a gene mutation. Quick sidebar on that is the research is still not 100% conclusive on that statement. Part of that is because stress by itself will increase the activity of CBS gene without a mutation. So there's still some uncertainty with that statement, but I want to for full transparency and disclosure here. But most of the research does point to the fact that that enzyme does go faster, not slower. And clinically, I do see that as well too. So that machine, when there's a gene mutation, goes faster, which means it's rapidly metabolizing homocysteine. It's very quickly turning homocysteine into cystathionine, which good for heart health, but the cystathionine, if we put too much into that sulfation pathway that's a little bit slow, if we put too much in too quickly, we're going to get backup of some of the components in that part of the factory, in that pathway. And that's why we end up with gut health, because cystathionine breaks down into cysteine, which can lead to hydrosulfic acid. We can have high sulfite levels from that as well too. Really important that we're distinguishing sulfite from sulfate, by the way. So the cystathionine breaks down into sulfite, and if there's a slowness to that pathway and too much is coming in, the sulfites are not going to get all the way through the pathway fast enough. So we end up getting elevations in sulfites and hydrosulfic acid, and even ammonia can build up in this because of this. Those components then, what they do is they lead to dysbiosis essentially in the gut, because they end up killing off some of the good bacteria and they are favorable for some bad bacteria. So you can get a lot of dysbiosis as a result because of this breakdown here. And then dysbiosis can lead to a lot of other problems. And then, for example, dysbiosis can then lead to high histamine levels. So we very commonly see high histamine with this pathway dysregulation as well too. And that can further lead to GI issues and allergy issues as well. And so what we end up clinically seeing is a lot of patients with IBS, a lot of patients with GERD, a lot of patients with SIBO. These are really common issues that are highly correlated with that mutation for those reasons. Now, that was a lot of information. I hope that all made sense. But essentially, the CBS gene goes too fast, puts too much pressure on the sulfation pathway. It backfires and causes these other buildup of amino acids that are unfavorable and lead to dysbiosis in the gut. And now you've got this cascade of dysbiosis leading to a number of different
wow.
GI issues.
You know, some of those SIBO and some of those sound pretty serious. I mean, it's not just, an upset stomach. It can be a pretty serious digestive issue.
Yeah.
So can you do things nutritionally or to help, or do you need?
Yeah. So typically what we do, there's a couple of things that we want to do. So one of the things is we've talked a little bit on some of our chats, for those who follow us regularly, about the homocysteine, people being methyl sensitive or being methyl cravers, right? So earlier in the factory, right, we talk about that MTHFR. That's what starts everything. We create these methyl groups that then donate to these other machines. Well, increased methyl groups will lead to higher levels. Okay, I'm pausing because I don't want people to get confused here.
Yeah.
But basically, what can happen is that the increased methyl groups can lead to faster recycling of homocysteine, but that leads also to more homocysteine for the CBS gene to use. So essentially, it ends up putting more methyl groups can put more pressure on a sulfation pathway, especially in the presence of a CBS mutation that's really just sucking up all the byproducts of methylation and pulling it into the sulfation pathway. That's a very simplified explanation, but I think that helps you guys understand what I'm trying to say here. So therefore, patients who have a CBS mutation, we have to be really careful with them supplementing with methylfolate and methyl B12 and SAM. E, that's another methyl donor. That's our master methyl donor, actually, that methylfolate makes. But those things we have to be really careful from a supplement standpoint. So we have to be careful with those. From a dietary standpoint, what we find is really, really helpful is when patients remove sulfur compounds from their gut. So, or from their diet, I should say. So people, and a lot of people, they'll come in, I can usually tell that they have a CBS gene already before looking at their genetics, because they'll say, I can't eat garlic and onions, it upsets my stomach. I can't eat too many Brussels sprouts or cruciferous vegetables, it upsets my stomach. I can't drink alcohol, specifically wine, which is high in sulfites, right? Everyone's like, ooh, buy sulfite-free wine. Just to clarify, there is no such thing as a sulfite-free wine. It does not exist. Sulfur metabolism is a byproduct of alcohol fermentation. They just, when you buy a sulfite-free wine, it's because they didn't add extra sulfites to speed up the fermentation process, but they are still in there, just to clarify. People don't realize that. Less so it's usually more tolerated, but still present. But anyway, I'm digressing. So if we remove sulfur compounds so that there's, again, less pressure on the sulfation pathway to have to keep up with all of these things, then that can take the pressure off and we can relieve the buildup of some of these byproducts. So when we do a sulfur-free diet, that usually is really, really helpful in minimizing the GI symptoms. And a lot of people will say, oh yeah, I can't eat cruciferous vegetables because there's too much fiber. And that's not true, not true. That does play a role as well too. So it may be that there's dysbiosis and you can't just metabolize the high fiber and cruciferous vegetables just for that reason. But it also may be because there's a CBS issue and you can't handle the sulfur compounds that are high in cruciferous vegetables and garlic and onions and eggs and alcohol. So, and there's like a few other like pickled meats and aged cheeses, also fall into that category as well too. So we end up removing these things from people's diet. And sometimes we also take histamine foods out of the diet, because I mentioned histamine can be an issue when there's a problem with the sulfation pathway. And we find that is so helpful. One of the things that's very unfortunate is that avocados are on the histamine list, which, for those of us in Southern California, that's like our bread and butter.
Yeah.
And, so sometimes it comes up that we find that people, can't really don't do well on the avocados because of the histamine count, which is very sad. But anyway, that doesn't happen very often. It was just sort of a side note, but essentially when we make these dietary recommendations, people do a lot better. Their GI health tends to really calm down when we do that.
Yeah, I mean, we're running out of time, but let me just summarize what I heard. So obviously CBS is a common mutation, correct? So a lot of people may have digestive issues and not even know it's a genetic predisposition. But the good news is that there are things that you really can do from a diet standpoint, but you should also be clear that if you are eating the wrong foods or taking the wrong supplements, you could be aggravating the situation.
Yes. Yeah. Right, exactly. And this is, I feel like this is where some of the really nuanced aspects of medicine and wellness and people trying to figure out their health is that it's not, you're not having, people are like, well, let me do a food sensitivity and an elimination diet and figure out, oh yeah, I can't eat eggs or I can't eat dairy or, gluten. And yes, a lot of those things are really helpful in alleviating people's symptoms, but sometimes people still have symptoms and it's, why? And this, people aren't going to think, oh, I need to stop eating broccoli, or kale, right? That's what we're all eating tons of. So it's a little bit non-intuitive when we realize that these are the foods that are making our digestive issues worse. And so it can be hard to figure out. So, having a functional medicine doctor and somebody who does genetics kind of support you in navigating that path can be really helpful because, people like myself and others, we sort of have our eye on those subtleties that can play a role and be that sort of mysterious, why is this still happening? Why is this not any better? And it can be confusing. And so looking at those other elements can be really helpful.
No, that's great. So the takeaway, again, get to a functional medicine doctor, treat the whole person. Yeah.
Yeah. But I mean, you can always experiment with a sulfur-free, histamine-free diet too, and see what's going on, and then, the challenge of course is that, once once we know that, oh yeah, you have a CBS gene, you're more prone to those things. So we know how to better manage it long term, but the dysbiosis has already been created. There's still a physical issue that still needs to be addressed, right? So we
Mhm.
still need to go in there and correct whatever that may be, you know, general dysbiosis or candidiasis or SIBO or whatever. We still need to now clean up that mess. You know,
Mhm.
the machines in the factory made a big mess on the floor. We need to go clean it up and then just know how to manage that part of the factory in the future so that it doesn't come back.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, great. All right. Well, it's our time is up for today.
Yes.
Anyway, I will talk to you next week.
Yep. Next week. And I think we are on chronic fatigue and anxiety next week as part of, and you know, what your genetics may be doing and to contribute to that. A lot of my patients with anxiety and chronic fatigue. So that's a big one for next week. So you guys want to tune in for that.
Right. All right, Doc. Take care. Hope the sun comes out.
Yeah. Supposedly this weekend. We'll see. We'll see.
All right. That would be beautiful. That would be wonderful. Okay, Doc.
We all need it. Yes.
All right. Take care.
Okay. Take care. Bye.